Today we're talking about a villain in the Marvel Universe, a foe to Matt Murdock, the Daredevil of Hell's Kitchen. It's a villain who's hard to pin down both physically and philosophically, whose enigmatic work is expressionist and abstract while also evoking the style, mood, and subversiveness of street art. A villain whose motivations, captured cryptically in his art, are as elusive and murky as a fog bank in a morning breeze. A villain who creates killer artwork. So killer, in fact, he's been called Vincent van Gogh, a villainous artist we may see in new mediums very soon. Let's talk about Muse. The man who would grow into the role of Muse was always an artist, but one drawn to more horrific and macabre stylings in his art. Eventually, he transitioned to serial killer status and used human flesh and body parts to create what he called art. He had an art studio where he kept his quote-unquote art supplies. It was a body shop, body part storage. Muse happens to also be superpowered. His powers are that of perception, manipulating the senses in a way that neutralizes them, rendering him nearly imperceptible to others. It allows him to infiltrate, invade, and stalk around undetected. It allows him to easily take out his victims, and it allows him to fly under the radar of heroes like Daredevil, who has heightened senses of his own. And so, though he was operating in New York City, Muse first appeared in Charles Soule and Ron Garney's 2016 run on Daredevil. Muse was already cutting a bloody swath through street-level Marvel even before he formally appeared. In Daredevil issue 5, he created art by slicing up a guy named Ten Fingers, leader of the Church of the Sheltering Hands, which has ties to the hand and to the demonic beast of the hand itself. Ten Fingers was ripped apart and strung up on a wall, illuminated only by the eerie flicker of burning candles, and he hung there in solitude until he was found by the authorities. Daredevil had slipped up on the Ten Fingers case, and so he was working an overnight shift and taking on hard cases to make up for it. Meanwhile, Samuel Chung, aka Blindspot, a vigilante that was effectively Daredevil's protege and sidekick at the time, was out on patrol. The people of Chinatown were leaving letters on Blindspot's doorstep for help. One such letter was an invitation to an art gallery in Washington Heights. So Blindspot traveled there and he stumbled across a murder scene, a crime scene whose backdrop was a large painting that was made with the blood of 113 people. One of them was the niece of City Councilwoman Andrea Pearson. The mysterious Muse used his superpowers to take down a group of thugs who were about to mug a newly made Inhuman. He was nearly imperceptible, a blur of motion and of light and shadow. This was at a time when the Terrigen mists were swirling around the globe and giving birth to legions of new Inhumans in the world. And this may in fact be the very same Terrigen mists that birthed Muse's own powers. Pearson showed up to put a stop to the art owner's plans to sell it on the secondary market. While working with the early Case Assessment Bureau, part of the Manhattan DA's office, Daredevil continued for weeks to covertly investigate who was behind the murders. The art piece had now gained some notoriety in the art scene and was being called the Blood Mural, and the name of its creator a pun on Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh. It turns out Pearson put in a request for help with the Bloody Mural case, and the DA put Matt Murdock on the case, bringing both of his identities on a collision course with this new villain. One night as the crowd gathered outside the gallery, an injunction came down preventing the gallery's opening. When the owner went in, he saw the blood mural was painted over. In its place, with a grisly crimson border, was the sentence, "You're only as good as your last performance," along with an address on East 171st Street. At that address, Murdock, Chung, and Officer Scott found a room with the bodies of the Inhumans, including the one saved from muggers that were deceased and posed as if they were doing very mundane tasks around the house. This was Muse's tableau of terror. Then Daredevil heard it, a heartbeat. He was able to get away from the group, put on his costume, and intercept Muse. Chalk white, clad in all black, with swirling pools of bloody crimson in his eyes spilling down to his torso, his hands a blend of ink and blood too. Seemingly devoid of nose and mouth, he asked Daredevil, "Did you like my work?" And then Muse activated his powers, drawing in sound and visuals and smell all around them, just like, as the thought blocks say, a black hole for sensory information. He said he didn't like the name he'd been given in the media, Vincent van Gogh. He thought it too undistinguished. He was thinking of going with Muse. Muse caught one of Daredevil's batons and snapped it in half, promising his next work of art will be better. He said he lived by a code, never explain and never apologize. Just as he pulled the pin from a flashbang grenade, the blast from the grenade blinded Daredevil's senses, forcing him to withdraw and allowing Muse to escape. Later, when Daredevil was dealing with the Inhumans after the tableau murders, Blindspot called him from a courtroom. Muse was actively attacking the court. Muse murdered some police officers, then took off with the judge as his hostage. Outside, Muse was met with a blockade of armed police. He was prepared though, and he launched a salvo of fireworks into the air right above their heads, and continued running with the judge on his shoulders. As Daredevil closed in, Muse disappeared down into the sewer system. Muse dropped the judge next to his other hostages and exclaimed, "It's time to create." He mused about his symbolism. He'd kidnapped a politician, 2 cops, and a judge, which represented the entirety of the legal system. These also happened to be the people who conspired to shut down public access to his blood mural. We also learn here that Muse had killed a lady once just because he thought she was ugly. He carved her bones into a knife to turn ugly into beauty. He started cutting his hostages up when Blindspot appeared, demanding he stop. But when Blindspot was almost taken down by a knife, he withdrew. Muse chased after him as if he was stalking his prey. He revealed he had his own name for the blood mural, Sanguinity, a portmanteau of sanguine or blood and serenity. Blindspot freed the hostages, then stood his ground against Muse, knowing he was outclassed but wanted to save the lives of the hostages. This was a truly selfless, heroic decision. Blindspot called Daredevil, but it was too late. Muse took a bound and gagged Blindspot to his garret of goriness, a veritable house of horrors. He monologued to Blindspot about how he was creating art that people objected to his preferred medium without truly understanding him. He mused out loud about what art he would make out of Blindspot, but that was cut short when Daredevil crashed through the window to save his protege, and then Muse shoved 2 of his fingers right into Blindspot's face, and he removed Blindspot's eyeballs. He dropped him to the ground and right into Daredevil's arms. Murdock caught up with the murderer in the dark. They thrashed and punched and cut and kicked their way through each other in brutal fashion. Daredevil tumbled into a room with hundreds of people strung up from the ceiling. Muse was harvesting their blood for his art. This is where the paint for Sanguinity came from. Outside, Muse was intercepted by Frank McGee and the new Adelan security force. They took Muse into custody, which also allowed Queen Medusa to remain strong in the eyes of her people for capturing the killer of Inhumans. Daredevil caught up with him in cuffs outside, and Frank promised Daredevil that he'd get justice. And Muse then broke his own fingers, telling Daredevil they were even for him taking Blindspot's eyes. Daredevil pulled off Muse's mask, and it was more of the same. A man in a mask, Muse stated creepily. Blindspot said because they'd saved all of the people strung up on the ceiling, that his sacrifice was worth it. In an interview with the website CBR, writer Charles Soule said that, quote, "I want to make it clear that this was part of Blindspot's story, not just some catalyst for change for Matt. Blindspot essentially chose this fate for himself. In a way, he sacrificed his eyes to save the lives of over 100 people. It was the culmination of the first phase of his heroic journey, a journey that's not complete, not even close." So Blindspot was taken in by the Hand, who took him to a temple in China to help with his sight. Lu Wei contacted the demonic beast of the Hand for help, and in turn, Blindspot became part of the Hand and retained a connection to the beast. Muse showed up again in issue 596, still in custody in New Adelan high-security detention. We meet up with him again as he's watching Daredevil be chased over rooftops by the NYPD after he'd attacked Mayor Wilson Fisk. And this is when Muse promised a security guard that he had chosen his next project and that he was leaving now. Issue 598 confirms that Muse is also an Inhuman, further confirmation that the Terrigen mist clouds were the catalyst for the birth of his powers. Though he was a killer his whole life, perhaps his power emerged in the recent past. Muse struck again in Banksy style, this time mysteriously painting a picture of Spider-Man on the side of the Javits building with the slogan, "Spiders are people too." This was another in a series of building-sized murals of Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Moon Knight, She-Hulk, and, most dramatically, a painting of Daredevil emulating Richard Nixon. Mayor Fisk wanted his "superheroes are vigilantes and vigilantes are criminals" narrative to land, and it couldn't while Muse was out there making the superheroes look like victims. In response, he ordered his forces to direct their focus to hunting down Muse. That night, a couple ladies stumbled across Muse finishing a mural of the Punisher. They took a picture together, and all that showed up was Muse's bloody eye sockets and some of his circulatory system. The police showed up, but Muse used his powers and killed half a dozen officers, beheading them while remaining ever stoic. Blindspot then went out and was using his paint and fire extinguishers to deface Muse's murals around the city. When he defaced the Daredevil painting, Muse appeared over his shoulder and shoved Blindspot right off a roof. Blindspot managed to grab onto a fire escape to stop his own fall. Blindspot did his best to fight Muse, but Muse was too skilled. He broke Blindspot's arm, then held him in an armbar while talking to Blindspot about the balance of justice and how he'd fallen in love with the grand illusion of life we've all surrounded ourselves with. Performative theater, but for what? Just then, Blindspot let the Hand's beast surge his power through him, and he blasted Muse to the ground. Blindspot used his beast powers to crush Muse's skull with its boot and smashed his face into the ground. He demanded to know why Muse did what he did, but infuriatingly, all Muse would say was that it was art. In many ways, this is him telling Blindspot and us, the readers, that it's open for interpretation. And sometimes, the way we choose to interpret things is a reflection of our own being. The Beast wanted Blindspot to kill Muse, but he rejected it, didn't want to be a killer. Muse, defeated, stumbled around in pain, upset that he wasn't the main character in his own story now. He stumbled and fell to his knees in a fire and burnt to a husk. The blank canvas of his facade was now gone. The story of Muse in comic book form was seemingly done, but not in other media, just like Muse would like. I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll ask you this. What will that mean for our Defenders of New York? Well, we'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.